Whether it is through the news, social media, or our personal conversations, our words make an impact. They can disenfranchise and negatively stereotype people living with mental health and substance use disorders, or they can normalize these disorders, providing hope and resources. The challenge is, how do we get the positive to permeate society? Thankfully, there are incredibly smart and dedicated minds who are working to influence the style and way we approach media. Our next moderator is a product of one of these programs. Christine Herman is a 2018-2019 Rosalind Carter Mental Health Journalism Fellow, a program that was founded on one essential premise: give journalists the resources they need to report on mental health. Christine applied those skills as a reporter at WILL Illinois Public Media and will be taking those lessons to her new role as managing editor of Side Effects Public Media based at WFYI. She is the future of this industry, and I'm very happy to have her moderate our final discussion. Christine, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Jim. I have such great respect for the work that the Kennedy Forum and the message that we're spreading here through this conference, so I'm really happy to be here today. So a little bit about myself. I was personally drawn to mental health reporting after I got connected with some families that were just dealing with some really hard stuff, trying to get their children help for serious mental health conditions that they had. And it all kind of snowballed from there. I learned about the lack of mental health resources in most communities, shortages of providers, issues getting insurers to pay for mental health treatment that was very much needed. And all these things that cause so much unnecessary suffering. And the more I learned, the more I just thought there has got to be a better way. And what would that look like? And how can I, as a journalist, contribute to this important work? So I'm really happy to be here and to be a part of this conversation. And as Jim mentioned, I'm here today with an impressive panel of experts who are working to incorporate so much of what we have heard throughout this conference into journalism. And while this topic is not new, we are seeing the increased need for the work that they are doing. Our first panelist is Dr. Stephen Adelsheim. Stephen is a clinical professor and associate chair for community engagement at Stanford's Department of Psychiatry, where he directs the Center for Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing. Steve also works in youth suicide prevention, tribal mental health, policy, integrated care, and telehealth. He previously spent many years leading school mental health efforts for the state of New Mexico and also served as the state's psychiatric medical director. Our second panelist is Scott McLeod. Scott and his wife, Susan Hack, are co-founders of the Sophie Fund. That's a nonprofit organization advocating for youth mental health initiatives in Ithaca. The Sophie Fund was established in memory of their daughter, Sophie, a Cornell University student who died by suicide in 2016. Before his work in mental health, Scott was a correspondent and bureau chief for 25 years for Time, based in Cairo, Johannesburg, Paris, and New York. And our third panelist is John Danishevsky. He's the vice president and editor-at-large for Standards of the Associated Press. He's a former foreign correspondent who has reported from Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia for the AP and the Los Angeles Times. John is a member of the board of the Pulitzer Prize and an advocate for the safety of journalists. Thank you all for being here today as we discuss journalism and mental health. So Stephen, I want to start with you. It's no surprise that those of us in journalism and those in mental health have been discussing for years the impact that words have on our perceptions. And in fact, at the APA's 2018 annual meeting in New York, you helped organize an informal roundtable of reporters and editors from major media and entertainment outlets and with psychiatrists and some of the nation's leading suicide prevention organizations. Can you tell us about what prompted you to do that?
Absolutely, Christine. It's great to be here and thank you. As you mentioned, I'm a child psychiatrist by training, and I spent many years before I came to Stanford working in New Mexico and was the director of school mental health programs there in the state. And in working with schools, was very involved often in dealing with, at times, crisis situations. And in that role, often became involved in responses to youth suicides when schools were trying to figure out how to do postvention and respond. And And as I became more involved in that work, some communities in different parts of the state would call on me as part of a state team to help them respond when there was more than one young person dying by suicide. And so I started learning painfully about this whole notion of contagion and youth suicide clusters and the increasing risk after one young person dies by suicide of other young people maybe following up in response. And then through the work of Maddie Gould and other people learned about the fact that the media plays a pretty important role in risk for contagion. And the fact that 5% of youth suicides are contagion and cluster related. As I then started chairing our child fatality review for the state and got more involved in this issue, it became very clear that at times the media issues were huge. And I found myself at times in small rural communities begging reporters for the Albuquerque Journal not to put the picture on the front page of the paper. Please don't put that memorial on the cover story. Don't make this the Sunday paper headline, please. And I didn't feel like many of the people in media understood their power in terms of the potential life and death, frankly, of many young people. And so it became important to me to get more involved in that work. And then I moved to Palo Alto at Stanford, which the year after I moved there with my family had its second cluster of youth suicides. And once again was involved in a community that had already been traumatized in looking at how to address this issue and continued to be involved in this work. And in fact, Palo Alto brought in the Center for Disease Control to look at the articles written about the suicides in the community and looked at them compared to what have been very clear standards about what not to say and what to say in writing about youth suicide, and found that on average, in all the articles that were written, generally the articles had 4 things you should not do per article and less than 1 of what you should do per article. And so there was a sense that even though there were guidelines, they weren't being followed. And that led to conversations with some of our national leaders from youth suicide prevention, who actually ultimately led me to Scott. And Scott shared with me his concerns about this issue and his vision. And ultimately then through the kindness of all of these youth suicide prevention programs and people like John and Scott and other journalists, we were able to come together and I was able to at least be a part of a conversation that had been happening, but through our American Psychiatric Association, we were able to become a partner as well.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to get into a discussion about guidelines and best practices for avoiding contagion. But before we do that, Scott, let's go to you next. You come to this work from a variety of different perspectives as a former journalist, former professor, and now as the head of a nonprofit mental health organization. So can you tell us about what interests and concerns you have regarding the intersection of journalism and mental health?
Yeah, we started the Sophie Fund, and we remain very focused on supporting youth mental health in a community of Ithaca, New York, which includes the universities there. But getting into this work as a non-expert in mental health, we really became very aware of how much work needs to be done, in the nation generally around mental health and suicide. On a personal level, we knew about Sophie's mental health issues, but we regret that we didn't have a deeper understanding about mental health and suicide. We were surprised to learn about the relatively mediocre level of care that she received during her mental health issues, and to the point that she gave up talk therapy and was self-medicating. So I feel that a great deal of progress can be made. More progress can be made if mental health professionals are better trained, and if the general public, and especially those struggling with mental health disorders, are better informed. A lot of this has to do with breaking down the stigma around mental health disorders and guiding people to hope and treatment. I think that's where the media can come in. I think whether it's the news media, the entertainment industry, or the social media platforms and users, I think a lot can be done. I'm certain that the media can do a much better job, and will do so if content providers in those three areas are given the tools.
John, a lot of what we've been talking about here relies on educating journalists to be sensitive and thoughtful when reporting on mental health and substance use. So I understand the Associated Press also publishes standards that journalists use when reporting. Can you talk about how the AP works to bring ethical and sensitive approaches to this work?
Sure. And, I have a lot of appreciation for Scott and Stephen, who both have helped educate me personally about this issue. And I think ultimately help to influence the AP standards around reporting on suicide and mental health. So the AP, as you probably know, is a 175-year-old not-for-profit news cooperative formed by basically the U.S. newspaper industry. And in the post-World War II era, we had an internal style book which we made available to our members, our newspaper members. And in the succeeding decades, it's become a pretty popular reference book in the news industry, the AP style book, and is referred to not only by journalists, but by librarians, copy editors, and outside organizations. So we have a style book committee within the AP that reviews certain issues and language questions that come up. And one of our focuses in recent years has been about reporting suicide and reporting about mental illness and giving our journalists guidelines. And so it does not only affect what the AP reports, but it affects broadcasters and newspapers who are customers of the AP and who use the AP style book. And, sometimes the discussions about what we should sort of put in concrete in the style book are always thoughtful. We try to be inclusive, get a lot of voices in the discussion. We interview experts, and that shapes our guidance. So a few years ago, we put out new guidance on suicide, for instance, that tells people that, in general, we don't report about suicides as a national news organization. We don't report individual suicides. We do, of course, cover the subject, the very important subject of suicide. But we tell our reporters not to talk about the method of suicide because of the fear of contagion. And other guidelines that would work to discourage people from doing anything that might cause harm. And that's one of the basic tenets of our journalism. We don't want anything we do as journalists per se to cause harm. We want to inform people. We want to help people make rational decisions, but we don't want to cause harm. And this is one area where actually the constructive things we do can not only not cause harm, but may accomplish some good.
Yeah. I love the principle of do no harm and thinking about how that applies here. For journalists who may be listening now, maybe who aren't entirely familiar about the do's and the don'ts, about best practices for reporting on suicides, especially maybe they're in a newsroom where they are given an assignment, do a story about this person who died by suicide. What are some of the basic principles? I know there are different resource guides out there, and maybe you can help also point journalists to where they can go online to find more information. But Stephen, can we start with you? What are some of the basic do's and don'ts of reporting on suicide in a way that does not cause harm?
Sure. So, what I will share with you is that there have been great guidelines that have been developed that speak to the issue, as John mentioned, about talking about means and not to include information about that. How does the report frame ultimately the suicide? Is the information on the front page, or where is it highlighted in the paper? Does the article address the inevitability of the situation or not? How much does it speculate about the causes and the reasons behind the person's death by suicide? Does it use appropriate language? One of the constant issues that comes up around this issue of committing suicide versus dying by suicide has been an ongoing issue. Are there descriptions of the method, as we mentioned, in the scene? Those are important issues. One thing I would share with you is that, through the Media and Mental Health Initiative that Scott's been a part of with us, and Chris Maxwell from the American Association of Suicidology, Victor Schwartz, and others from our center, and through the leadership, frankly, as I mentioned, of the group that was reviewing all those articles with the Center for Disease Control, have actually put together a tool that journalists could use as well, in addition to the wonderful guidelines from AP and others, called the Tempos tool, the tool for evaluating media portrayals of suicide, that we've developed now on our webpage for our partnership, that really helps a journalist sort of walk through each of these 10 different areas and gives examples of what might be better to say and what might be not as good to say, and lets you rate your story in relation to those guidelines. So, we're trying to find ways to make this as simple as possible for journalists to have a sense of those tools, to look at how their stories measure up. And then, for editors also to consider as well, because frankly, as someone from the outside, when I've followed up with reporters about the issues of their stories, sometimes what they'll tell me is, well, I understood the guidelines, but the photo editor wanted the memorial, and the headline editor wanted the big numbers, and, and the picture of the young person. And so part of the issue also becomes, even when we have these guidelines available, how do we work with the leadership within journalism to ensure that they're following these as well?
I'd like to add my perspective on that. After Sophie's death, the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why was released. And, we were learning a lot more about mental health and suicide at that time. And we observed alarm among many mental health experts that we had come to respect. And I had many questions, like if the storyline and the graphic depictions that were in 13 Reasons Why created a risk of contagion suicides, how could the series get made? And why didn't the producers, understand the risk, or perhaps not care about the risk? And where was the mental health community, who could have provided some guidance when this was in production, or even in, the idea to produce a movie about that book? So from my perspective, the guidelines are great. They're important. AP has done a fantastic job, not only with suicide guidelines, but in standards and practices in general, keeping our journalistic community on best practices. But what really concerns me is, let's find ways that these guidelines are followed, because they're not being followed universally. I would even go so far as to say, the 13 Why was, for me, maybe a more, atypical case, maybe, of what they did. But the even in the newspaper business, that I've been part of, the media business, I found that so many, even the best news organizations, were avoiding the best practices repeatedly. And so it seems to me that we really need to find a way to, get into the newsrooms, get into the production rooms, and really make sure that media professionals and content producers, wherever they may be, actually are aware of the guidelines and understand the reasons for the guidelines. And I believe that a lot of people in the mental health community would speak to me and say, well, journalists are cynical. They don't want to listen to us, and they're defensive, and they maybe feel that we're trying to manipulate or censor their stories. I think that the media content producers are responsible people, and I think that they are open to discussions about, being educated better about mental health and about how their work would affect, people who are struggling, or just in terms of, general education about mental health to break down stigma.
I would agree with that. I think there always is some tension in the newsroom between the reporters who feel, well, let's just put everything, all the information we have out there, and let the reader or the consumer of news decide if it's worthwhile or not for them. And there's also often a knee-jerk feeling that we should disclose everything we know about certain cases. But I usually answer those journalists just with a reminder that we often do withhold some details in our reporting if we feel that they could be harmful. We don't disclose in times of war. We don't disclose troop locations or deployments. We don't name victims of sexual crimes or harassment who wish to remain anonymous. And I think this is an area where by not highlighting or amplifying details of a suicide, it's really our professional duty to not do that, because it would be harmful. And of course, there are journalists who say, well, there's no proof, there's no empirical studies to show this. And, thanks to Stephen, I've been able to, point out that there is empirical proof of this. And but I would say the vast majority of our journalists are trying to do the right thing. And I often I receive questions from AP journalists saying, this person died by suicide. How shall I handle it in the obituary? And those kind of case by case questions come up all the time, because they're actually looking at our style guidance and then trying to do the right thing.
I would add, Christine, that there's a natural conflict here that's very understandable, not to fault the media. We journalists are taught, go get the story, get the details, get the texture, and it's the details and the texture that are going to make a good yarn. And we want to, it's not so much entertaining readers, but hooking them on a good story. And the kind of details that a journalist would intuitively want to get are things like the contents of a suicide note, or the way somebody died by suicide, particularly if it's a celebrity death, for example. And that's what they're trained to do: get the story, get the details. But unfortunately, in mental health, those details can be harmful. So we need to find a way to work with journalists and work with movie writers, script writers, and movie producers to make them understand that we need to work out this conflict.
Yeah. I feel like it can also be difficult with social media, and perhaps there are other outlets out there that are putting the details out there, and then to choose to withhold them from your story when it's already out there, that I imagine could be another type of conflict that might be being experienced within newsrooms. I also think about how just with the way that journalism has been struggling as an industry, they're just newsrooms are downsizing. There might not be a specialized beat reporter who covers health, even let alone mental health. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen, and that's why I appreciate programs like the Carter Center and the Kennedy Forum, and then the work that you all do as well for trying to get this information out there for both the reporters as well as the newsroom leaders like you, John. Other comments or suggestions that you have for how the industry can evolve? I know we've been pretty focused on reporting on suicide, but there's also mental health and substance use disorders more generally. And John, let's start with you. Thoughts on how the industry can further evolve to be putting out work and content that is helpful in terms of reducing stigma and not contributing to stigma and not causing harm.
Well, we've been having a lot of discussion about mental health, and one issue that's come up is the sort of casual use of mental health descriptive words in a sort of a non-clinical way. So, saying, the play was really schizophrenic, or that the person was deranged. We were telling our journalists not to throw around terms like that in their reporting and to show some sensitivity. We also encourage them to use people first language. So instead of saying this person is a schizophrenic, you might say the person has a schizophrenic disorder or something like that, pointing out that the disorder is not what defines the person. So we want to use that people first language. And we also are very conscious that police authorities sometimes throw around mental health terms, or neighbors will attach a mental health label to someone who's not really qualified to diagnose that. So we say, don't use this kind of descriptors unless there's actually some corroborating evidence for the facts of the matter. So the style book has sort of evolved from being sort of a dictionary of words and terms into it has a lot of sections that are more discussions about the topic. So in the case of suicide, or in the case of mental health, we have a sort of a chapter to tell journalists, these are factors you should consider when reporting on these topics. And we've also become much more liberal about encouraging our journalists to attach editor's notes to stories about suicide or domestic violence or addiction, telling people what resources exist, where if they are suffering similar problems as are described in the story, where they can reach for help.
Yeah. Stephen, anything you'd add to that?
Sure. Locally, this has been a big issue in, the Palo Alto community and in Silicon Valley as a response to the issues here. And, one great example of a positive response to this effort has actually been the local Palo Alto weekly newspaper. And the person who was their primary health and schools reporter for many years, Elena Combini, did a real transformation in her reporting over a period of years, and their editorial staff as well. They developed a clearly written policy about how to cover articles related to suicide and mental health, and they followed it, for one. And as new reporters came in, they were trained in the policy that was there within the context of the paper. They really worked to follow the guidelines and now use sort of the Tempos model as they think about, how to respond to these articles. And as John was mentioning, developing resource pages that are consistently updated and in partnership with mental health professionals are able to link people to positive resources in the community. The editor's note that he mentioned became a important piece. And then also, for these local online forums, really monitoring well the comments that come up at the end of stories and ensuring that they were safe and appropriate as well. So some of those things have been very important. They also reached out actually to our high school communities and our young people. They interviewed them and also really focused on highlighting, stories about positive responses, people handling struggles well, what's called the Papageno effect, in terms of this idea that if you can highlight people finding hope and recovery and success and highlighting those stories as well, it can decrease suicide risk. And that not only has happened in this community, but even the high school newspapers started putting in regular stories of students, of teachers, of staff, of administration, and others in the community, highlighting people facing challenges in a really positive way. So I think there are lots of ways to destigmatize mental health issues by talking about the challenges we all face, because mental health issues pervade all of our families, whether we talk about it or not. But acknowledging that and then really talking about and finding ways to highlight how people handle situations successfully can be really valuable and increase the resiliency of our young people and all of our families.
Yeah.
I'd like to echo what Stephen
Yeah.
said. I think we've been talking a lot about guidelines and all the don'ts, but I think that one of the really important things for me is to encourage media to tell more positive stories about mental health and even suicide, to break down the stigma, to normalize or mainstream mental health and suicide, if you will, so that it doesn't become this taboo topic that you just whisper about. And I think that what this example from Palo Alto is very important. I think if the media were regularly talking about mental health heroes, mental health success stories, how people have overcome addiction to lead successful lives, I think all of these things, contribute to a better education for the public. And, in my experience, a lot of practitioners need more education in breaking down the stigma that they even have in terms of mental health practitioners. And so in Ithaca, this is a very small mom and pop operation, our Sophie Fund, but we've created a website with accompanying social media platforms really to do sort of community journalism around the mental health issues in the community. Some of the local newspapers, well, they're very small and tiny and online now, but they do some good coverage on some of the issues, but they don't have the staff, as you mentioned, Christine, to really, cover it extensively, and they don't have reporters necessarily dedicated to health or mental health. So the Sophie Fund website has become a kind of community newspaper, and we're writing a lot about student mental health. We've been doing an Instagram campaign this month on sexual assault on college campuses. This is the so-called red zone period where sexual assaults are more common and likely to occur on college campuses. And so I think that education piece and putting out, education, information, and positive stories about success, and prescriptive pieces about things that could be done to improve the community's mental health. I think these are really important things for the media to do more of. And I have to say one thing, if I may add. This has all sounded pretty critical, but the media has come a long way in the 45 years I've been a journalist to doing a better job. But, as long as people are dying by suicide, and as long as so many people, and the numbers are increasing, are struggling with mental health, our job's not done. We have a lot of work to do still.
Yeah. I appreciate the input on not just the don'ts, but also the do's, because the last thing I'd want to have happen is journalists be afraid of reporting on mental health or afraid of reporting on suicide because they don't want to do it wrong. But the encouragement and the guidelines for how to do it well and how even to help and be a force for good on this issue. I think that's really important. So thank you for this discussion. We just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask each of you to share. It's a toss-up here, so you can choose one action that you think our audience can do to follow up on this conversation, or what is something that's giving you hope right now, given that this has been a really difficult year and a half through the pandemic for the world, and especially for people living with mental illness and with substance use disorders. What bright spots are you seeing? What's giving you hope? Let's start with you, Stephen.
Okay, so I'm going to answer both questions, though, I'm afraid. So giving me hope is the voice of our young people. And as we're seeing the resiliency of our youth in our community and around the country in response to the many challenges that they've faced, we're seeing lots of reasons to hope. And, you know, within our community, our young people have actually gotten very involved in this issue. They've started a website and Instagram page around having a good relationship with social media called Good for Media, have been involved in reaching out to journalists when they see things not being done in an appropriate way and helping them correct it online. So the voice of our young people and following their wisdom, I think, is a really important piece for us. And I would just also add that if we can be of support, as I mentioned, Scott and other colleagues, Victor Schwartz, Chris Maxwell, our wonderful social media leader, Vicki Harrison, you know, we're working now in partnership with many on this media and mental health initiative out of our department. And I think if we can be of support or consultation, we really want to be able to help kind of lift up this vision of collaboration around journalistic media, social media, and entertainment as well. So consider us a resource, hopefully, in the future.
Thank you, Stephen. John, one action item or something that's giving you hope, or both?
Well, I think there is a growing awareness. I mean, you know, we saw because of some of the travails around anxiety and depression among star athletes, we saw this whole movement saying it's okay not to be okay, and you should reach out if you're feeling badly. I think this is something that definitely needs to be stressed and amplified by news media. And I think there's a great willingness now. I mean, the whole country is traumatized by what we've been through with COVID, and we've all heard about, you know, population declines and deaths by despair. And I think there's a growing awareness across society that this is a problem that's not really at the margins of our society, but it really strikes at the heart of it. So I'm very happy that the news media, in civil society, and in government, and as Stephen said, among young people, there's a gathering awareness that this is really job one, to take care of ourselves.
Scott?
I would say that I'm really grateful to Stanford University and Steve and his team there for creating this initiative to engage the media, to provide resources and education and so forth. And I think it has a lot of promise. I would just add, though, that we can't create a website with a guideline and expect that it's going to change the world. I think that we really need to have a robust engagement and conversation with all these media platforms. Social media, which we haven't talked much about, is a huge area for engagement and change. But I would urge folks who are a part of this conference to think about how they can be proactive in engaging the media in their locations, whether they are mental health organizations, mental health or healthcare practitioners, or just mental health advocates, individuals, to pay attention to what the media is doing, to encourage their local, form relationships with their local editors and journalists who cover health, try to point them to good news, positive stories that they could cover, to educate the public. We're very involved in Ithaca in trying to bring the zero suicide model in healthcare to that community. And this is a fantastic model for preventing suicide, and it's available to be implemented nationally, but very few journalists have written stories about it. So, articles about what great work that specialists are doing and researchers to advance knowledge about mental health disorders and suicide and treatments for them. I think these are really important stories that would also help to break down, confusion, misunderstanding, misconceptions, and stigma.
I'll just do a little bit of practicing what we've been talking about today and just say that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, if you or someone you know is struggling, is 1-800-273-8255. I'd like to just thank each of our panelists who've been joining us today, just for all you do to advocate for this issue and for the safety of journalists and for ethics in journalism. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Christine.
Yeah.